levels?
So right now, I'm here with producer Laura Benshoff. We are about a block or so away from Capital One Arena, where a lot of the people who have come here to attend the inauguration are hoping to get inside. There is a really, really long line. This line is snaking for blocks and blocks, and as we've been walking up and down, we see a lot of people selling stuff. The MAGA gear is going like hotcakes.
Hats and gloves and scarves, guys. Hats, gloves, scarves, hats, gloves, guys. Gloves, hats.
Crowds of Trump supporters in D.C. were supposed to be watching the inauguration on the National Mall. Plans changed last minute because of the extremely cold weather. So supporters crowded into indoor space at the Capital One Arena, and the ceremony took place in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol.
So Trump is walking through the crypt right now as he gets ready to head upstairs to the rotunda.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President-elect of the United States, the Honorable Donald John Trump.
The golden age of America begins right now. From this day forward, our country will flourish and be respected again all over the world. We will be the envy of every nation, and we will not allow ourselves to be taken advantage of any longer. During every single day of the Trump administration, I will very simply put America first.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Monday, January 20th. Today, the second inauguration of Donald Trump. After a dramatic election and a felony conviction, President Trump is back in power. We'll talk about the new vision for America Trump laid out on his first day in office and what he's already doing to make it happen. And we'll hear about the excitement from supporters who have flooded the city. So let me ask this, thinking past the actual inauguration ceremony, what are you expecting from the second term of the Trump presidency?
Everything. Everything that he said he was going to do, he is going to do.
This morning, I spoke to so many Trump supporters who traveled from across the country. That was Cheryl Beeler. She came all the way from Hawaii. I also spoke with Summer Boger.
Can I ask
where you're from?
San Diego. Well, I personally want to see the J6ers released.
And there was Tom Klein from Tulsa. He was with his 14-year-old son, Tommy.
I'm expecting a more secure border, stop funding wars, unnecessary wars, protect our people, and get the economy back in shape.
The people we spoke with were ecstatic for Trump's first day in office, and they were hopeful that a lot could change quickly. That's what we heard from Keith Scott of Pismo Beach, California.
Our economy is in the ruins right now, so he needs to try and get that going.
My number one priority is the safety of my children and grandchildren and yours too. We have got to get that wall finished, and we have got to get our immigration under control, the illegal immigration.
I think he's going to start from the get-go. He's not going to wait to get to the White House or tomorrow or whenever. He's getting things done, and it's good to see that.
So that's what we heard Monday morning from some of Trump's supporters. Then, after Trump's first address to the nation, I sat down with my colleague Dan Baltz, who's the chief correspondent for national politics for The Post. So Dan, President Trump has just been sworn in, and he is now the president again. I first want to talk about the inauguration ceremony and the speech that Trump made directly after he was sworn in. This was a speech where he was describing his vision for America and for the Trump presidency 2.0. What was this overarching vision? What did you hear in this speech?
I think we heard in the speech everything we heard during the campaign. I mean, I think it was remarkable in that way. You know, I've described it as part State of the Union address and part campaign rally, with a little bit of the kind of the traditional flourishes that you see in an inaugural address. But this was different than most of the inaugural addresses we've seen. Rarely have we seen any president, in essence, outline with specificity the kinds of things that he was planning to do on day one.
Today I will sign a series of historic executive orders. With these actions, we will begin the complete restoration of America and the revolution of common sense. It's all about common sense.
He's signing a whole series of executive orders, way more than any president has done on day one.
First, I will declare a national emergency at our southern border.
And he talked about many of those in the inaugural address.
Today, I will also declare a national energy emergency. We will drill, baby, drill.
Usually at an inaugural ceremony, it is a bit more staid. It has a rhythm, given all of the introductions of dignitaries and past presidents and everybody who comes in. I mean, there's a formality to it. But what struck me about this is that even in that kind of a setting, Donald Trump is Donald Trump. And while he was reading off the teleprompter, he was nonetheless delivering the kind of Trumpian message that we have been used to. I mean, it was a dark message.
As we gather today, our government confronts a crisis of trust. For many years, a radical and corrupt establishment has extracted power and wealth from our citizens while the pillars of our society lay broken and seemingly in complete disrepair.
The portrait of the country that he painted was very grim. You know, a government that can't function, that it protects criminals but not its own people.
We now have a government that cannot manage even a simple crisis at home, while at the same time stumbling into a continuing catalog of catastrophic events abroad.
You know, on and on and on. It wasn't quite American carnage from 8 years ago, but there were touches of that throughout.
In terms of describing the state of America right now and basically, in his words, how awful things are right now.
Right. And with President Biden sitting a few feet away from him, literally shredding the last 4 years and previous administrations as well. But this was not a kind of a moment in which he was saying, we're going to build on where we are. This was, we are in a terrible mess, and the people, you know, some of the people on this stage are responsible for it, and I'm here to save you.
One thing that really surprised me, one thing that I didn't expect at all from this speech, was there was this theme of American expansion.
The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons.
About taking back the Panama Canal, about growing America's presence in space, about renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. Tell me more about what you heard there, why we were hearing this theme come up.
Well, he's a salesman, he's a developer, he's somebody who speaks extravagantly, tries to paint big, bright, bold pictures. But, you know, there's another element to all of that. I mean, I think that's part of what he's trying to do. He wants to make clear that he's got ambitions that go beyond what anybody prior to him has had. But there's also an element of the kind of the culture wars that are inherent in those actions and those things he's talking about, you know, the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, to taking back the Panama Canal.
In which he described some of the history of how the Panama Canal ended up in the possession of Panama that I think glossed over some of the nuances.
It glossed over history in some significant ways, but that's Donald Trump. I mean, we know from the time he came on the scene that he exaggerates, he distorts, he sometimes lies. So part of that is in the retelling. But I think that those are things that may or may not happen, right? Or that he can say, I've taken this action even if it doesn't stick. I think that the more important things that he talked about today were the other executive orders. This notion of a new manifest destiny is interesting, and it will be controversial, and he'll get people to talk about it. But sometimes he does things to distract from other things he's doing, and that may be part of what he's doing here.
Dan, you also mentioned the idea of culture wars making an appearance in this speech, you know, talking about going back to men being men and women being women and the federal government really like enforcing that.
As of today, it will henceforth be the official policy of the United States government that there are only two genders, male and female.
Or his plan to exonerate the members of the military who refused to be vaccinated. Tell me about how his use of some of these culture war references in this speech were an important touchstone for him.
Many of those things are very important to his hardcore MAGA base. And I think that he is always going to give nods to that base, even as he's trying to do other things. Part of that was that element. I mean, I think if you would talk to Trump's advisors, they would say in everything he does, he will have to throw out, or he will throw out, some kernels or red meat or whatever to his hardcore base. And I think that is part of it. And he knows that he has to continue to give them sustenance and make it clear to them that he's listening to them, that he's trying to act on the things that they care a lot about.
I want to talk a little bit about this inauguration ceremony and how it unfolded, because as we mentioned a little bit earlier, this was not the usual way that an inauguration plays out, because it was inside, because it's so cold in D.C. right now. And I think a lot of people recognize that it was just going to be miserable for everybody involved. But that ended up having an effect in terms of this took place in the Capitol Rotunda, and it was a much smaller group around Trump and in his line of sight than would otherwise have been the case. And so we saw people missing from that immediate circle around Trump. There were a lot of governors who didn't get a seat in the Rotunda. But then at the same time, it emphasized the people who were there. Elon Musk was there. Jeff Bezos, who also owns the Washington Post, he was there. The CEO of TikTok, Joe Rogan, the podcaster. I mean, what did you make of the faces in the crowd that you saw there and the faces that you didn't see there, and what they tell you about this moment?
Well, I think that most of the focus that certainly the cameras were on were the tech billionaires. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's symbolic of a couple of things. One is the role that Elon Musk is playing as a confidant of Donald Trump, quite apart from the other tech billionaires. I mean, Elon Musk has insinuated himself into the Trump administration in ways that I don't think anybody anticipated 6 or 8 months ago. I mean, this is a person who clearly has Trump's ear and is trying to do things on Trump's behalf. I think the other piece of it is Silicon Valley was not, Trump's friends 8 years ago. And I think that they have decided, those billionaires have decided, that they need to have a different relationship with President Trump in his second term than in the first term.
Yeah, you saw Mark Zuckerberg of Meta/Facebook, right, who is,
Well, who has gone farther than almost anybody other than Elon Musk, helping to host a party, a variety of different things. He's put Dana White on his board, the head of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. They want a different relationship. They don't want the Trump administration to be at war with them. And so they have reached out and tried to say, we want to work with you as best we can. Trump likes nothing better than to have people who were once his enemies come to him almost as supplicants. And so I think to some extent, putting them in a very visible way was, for him, a way of symbolizing, I have the power. They want to be close to me, and so I'll have them here.
For me, I feel like the visual symbolism of this ceremony taking place inside the Capitol Rotunda is also impossible to separate from the legacy of January 6th. And the idea that just over 4 years ago, you had violent insurrectionists inside this same space in the name of Donald Trump and this so-called rigged election, which is not true, creating havoc there. And here we are 4 years later with Trump in the same space, basking in this moment of achievement and of vindication for him and his political journey. The split screen felt very present.
Yeah, I don't think anybody could look at that and not think about January 6, 2021. And, oddly enough, in both cases, you had Trump loyalists in the Capitol. But 4 years ago, they were sacking the Capitol in the hope of delaying the certification of Joe Biden's victory and trying to keep Donald Trump in power. This time, it's a far different group of people. It's not the grassroots. It's the elite who are there, but loyalists to Donald Trump nonetheless. But I think your point is right that some of this is a vindication for Trump, or at least in his own mind. And truthfully, having, won the popular vote this time, which he did not do in 2016 or certainly 2020 when he lost to Biden, winning a comfortable majority in the Electoral College. He comes into this second term in a different place politically.
Which he made sure to point out during the speech.
Well, he did, but to some extent, if you win, you get to brag a little bit. You get to write the history of what happened. But I think there is a kind of a consensus that he is stronger than he's been, he's more formidable than he's been, and that everybody is paying attention to him in a different way. Then it was, we don't know what we're going to get with Donald Trump in his first term. Now it is, we pretty much know what he wants to do, and he may be able to do it. And it's why half the country is still on edge, and much of the world is wondering what actually is this second Trump going to mean? What of 12 years of Donald Trump as the dominant figure in American politics ultimately going to mean to the world in the future?
I want to stay on the issue of January 6th for one more moment, because what a lot of people expected from this inaugural speech was for him to talk about the January 6th rioters and potentially pardoning them, which is one of our expectations of one of the first things that he's going to do as president again. It didn't come up during that speech, but then it did come up in the second impromptu speech that he gave shortly after the first one, and this is where he went to a different part of the Capitol where some of his other supporters were gathered in an overflow space, watching the ceremony on screen.
But I just want to say, you're a younger, far more beautiful audience that I just spoke to.
And he talked about his intention to pardon these people.
And you're going to see a lot of action on the J6 hostages. See a lot of action.
He talked about all the things that he was told to leave out of his official speech that he now wanted to share with his real supporters.
And I did have a couple of things, to say that were extremely controversial. And between JD and Melania and anybody else that heard, please, sir, it's such a beautiful unifying speech. Please, sir, don't say these things. I said, I'm telling you, it's going to play great.
And then he also talked about his political enemies. He talked about Liz Cheney. He talked about Hillary Clinton. This idea that he was taking the high road in this more official speech was kind of negated by some of the things that he said in this second speech, where you could hear more of the vindictiveness.
Yeah, I think it was very striking that this was more the old Donald Trump, the Donald Trump who goes off the rails, Donald Trump who says things that his advisors would prefer that he not say.
And he was clearly so thrilled to not have to read the teleprompter anymore and to be able to speak off the cuff.
Yeah, he was. And this is the off the cuff Donald Trump, the kind of Donald Trump that we've seen at political rallies for a number of years now. He is somebody who has a series of grievances. He feels that the Justice Department was weaponized against him. And I don't think that even, the victory that he won in November begins to drain that out of his being. I think that is there as a permanent part of who he is. I also think the fact that President Biden, on his way out of office, pardoned a whole series of people, including the January 6th Select Committee members, stuck in Trump's craw. But it was striking that he used that more informal speech to just get a whole lot of stuff off his chest that he wasn't able to do in the formal ceremony.
You mentioned those actions by President Biden shortly before he left office, and I just want to explain a little bit more here. So these were pardons that he announced for people like Liz Cheney and other January 6th committee members, as you said. He pardoned members of his family preemptively, basically to prevent any scenario where they are targeted for what Biden described as a political prosecution. He also pardoned Dr. Anthony Fauci, who had a huge role in coordinating the federal government's response to the coronavirus pandemic. And again, not saying that there was any admission of guilt, or this isn't to say that any of these people did anything wrong, but because he's fearful that they could be targeted under the next administration. So I found it interesting during the speech today, then, Trump basically talking about politically motivated investigations and saying, this is the end of that.
The vicious, violent, and unfair weaponization of the Justice Department and our government will end.
What do you make of that? Do you think this is a serious promise from Trump that he's not going to try to go after some of his political enemies using the state?
I have no idea. I mean, it runs contrary to what he had said during the campaign. It runs contrary to some of the people that he wants to appoint to the Justice Department and things that they have said. So we're going to have to see what it is. I think that until we know more, people will be concerned that he will go after some of the people that he feels went after him. And we'll just have to wait and see on that. I don't know.
We'll be right back.
I'm Jessica Contreras, and I'm a reporter at The Washington Post. Every day at The Post, we are trying to make sure that we are holding powerful institutions accountable. For the last 2 years, for me, that has meant looking at child sexual abuse by members of law enforcement all across the country. We identified at least 1,800 police officers who have been arrested for crimes involving child sexual abuse from 2005 through 2022. That number, figuring out that this is happening and figuring out how it's happening, it never would have been possible without the time and resources it takes to do an investigation like this. And when you subscribe to The Washington Post, that's the kind of work that you're supporting, making sure that powerful institutions are held accountable by the taxpayers who pay for their work. Subscriptions support this work and the people behind it. I'm Jessica Contreras, and I'm one of the people behind The Post.
All right, so Dan, I want to come back to executive orders and not just what Trump said today, but what Trump is doing. Right now, we're talking shortly before 5 p.m., and this is a day where Trump has promised to sign this flurry of executive orders. What is your sense of the priorities that Trump has of things that he wants to get done in these very first days and that he can carry out with executive orders?
Well, the first priority is and has been immigration. That was the first thing in the Republican Party platform that was approved at the convention last summer. And it's what Trump believes was the most important issue that helped him win election. I think others would say it was probably the economy and inflation, but he believes that immigration is the key. And he will have seemingly a set of orders on that. He said in the inaugural address that one would declare an emergency on the southern border, and presumably there will be something that will trigger an effort to begin what he has promised as mass deportations of people who are here without documentation.
This is a relatively small, or at least kind of specific detail, but our colleague, Aurelius Hernandez, has been reporting from Texas on how people at the border have already seen that the app that they have been using to have an appointment with U.S. Customs and Border Protection in their effort to be able to cross the border into the U.S., that app is showing that these scheduled interviews are canceled. Then this started right after Trump became officially president, and that already there are things that are sort of snapping into place that are making it harder for people to.
Yeah, I was struck by that. And it's an indication of the seriousness by which he takes this issue and his willingness to shut down the border. So I think that's the first area that he's going after. He talked about things on energy and, the drill, baby, drill.
People love that phrase.
People do love that phrase. And he above all, people love that phrase. But that's another area that they're going to do. He talked about tariffs and the creation of a Department of External Revenue. He thinks all that money's going to come into the Treasury. That's not necessarily the case. But again, that's an area that he wants to go after. And then he talked about some of these things having to do with race and gender that you mentioned earlier.
So these coming days are going to be a period where we're expecting to see so much news, so much coming out of the federal government, so many executive orders and other announcements about what is about to change. What are you going to be paying attention to? And I guess what is your advice to folks who are trying to understand what's going on and what's changing, knowing that sort of the point of this is for it to be overwhelming? Yeah,
that's this sort of notion of shock and awe on the part of the new president to set the direction and really put his opponents back on their heels. I think that's part of the goal. But I think the other thing to remember is this is week one, or this will be weeks 1 and 2 of a 4-year presidency in which he's going to face problems that we can't even describe at this point. So yes, he has priorities and intentions. And yes, he is moving very quickly. And frankly, I think we should take all of that very seriously and also recognize that he's far better prepared this time than he was 8 years ago. But this administration has a long way to run, and they can get off to a fast start. They could get off to a fast but rocky start. So I would say to people, pay close attention, but don't leap to conclusions about what the end is going to be like, where this ultimately is going to fall.
Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dan Balz is the chief correspondent for national politics for The Post. You also heard reporting from our colleagues Libby Casey and Laura Benshoff. Later Monday evening, after we wrapped our conversation with Dan, Trump did in fact sign a series of executive actions. They include freezing new federal regulations at hiring, targeting birthright citizenship, withdrawing the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement, and delaying the TikTok ban, among other actions. Many of these orders are likely to be challenged in court. Trump also signed pardons for January 6th criminal defendants, providing clemency to over 1,000 people who participated in the attack on the Capitol. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. This has been a momentous inauguration day, but today is also a national holiday to celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and I want to share some news about an event that I'll be taking part in next weekend, focused on the legacy of Dr. King. It's a live podcast taping here in downtown D.C. at the Apple Carnegie Library, talking with Ryan Williams from the D.C. Public Library. Ryan has fascinating things to say about the legacy of Dr. King, the role of libraries as a force for social change, and reading as a revolutionary act. This event is going to take place 2 p.m. on Saturday, January 25th. If you want to join us, you should sign up in advance. We'll put a link in today's show notes and at postreports.com. Today's show was produced by Laura Benshoff and Ted Muldoon, who also mixed the show. It was edited by Rena Flores. Thanks also to Anna Ashbrenner. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.